And so as we pick it up here in verse 11, we had gotten to as far as Saul, who was the first king of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, having disqualified himself and all of that, as it mentions at the end of chapter 10. We find that he had died in battle, and the reasons were given there at the end of verse 13, but it shifts very quickly to David as we come into chapter 11. And 11 and 12, they seem to be well packaged together, in that this is going to be looking at some of the military backing or the strength kind of behind his rule as it relates to some of the other people that were there working alongside to establish the kingdom under David. And so it says, chapter 11, verse 1, Then all Israel gathered themselves to David unto Hebron, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. And moreover, in time past, even when Saul was king, thou wast he that leddest out and broughtest in Israel. And the Lord thy God said unto thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be ruler over my people Israel. Therefore came all the elders of Israel to the king to Hebron, and David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. This is really interesting. We see that there was this group of people confederate to be able to make David king. They came to Hebron, and this is kind of excluding 7 years when David was ruling in Hebron. It gets right to the end of what was this other son of Saul, Ishbosheth's reign. He seemed to be kind of weak. He ended up being assassinated. But David was the one who was intended to reign all the way back to Samuel anointing him. It says that they came to anoint him as king there in verse 3. This would have actually been like the third time that he was anointed king. He was anointed the first time by just Samuel. He would have been anointed a second time after the death of Saul. And now this third time when all the rest of the tribes were kind of getting behind his reign, his kingly reign. So here they're coming, and this would have kind of been excluding some of the other ones that weren't mentioned, but this would have really actually been the third time that he was anointed. Really interesting as we see some of these things happening. They're all coming to establish him, and it's according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. Well, verse 4 says, And David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, which is Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, Thou shalt not come hither. Nevertheless, David took the castle of Zion, which is the city of David. And David said, Whosoever smiteth the Jebusites first shall be chief and captain. So Joab the son of Zeruiah went first up and was chief. And David dwelt in the castle, therefore they called it the city of David. And he built the city round about, even from Millo round about, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. So David waxed greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. We see that here in verse 4, and this is really interesting to me. This is some 400 years or so after the children of Israel coming out of Egypt and possessing the land. This is some 400 years later that they should have gotten all the rest of the people that were in the land out. There shouldn't have been Jebusites in the land. They should have been able to get them all out. All the Canaanites, all the Hittites, all the Jebusites, all the other ites were supposed to be out of there, except for Israelites. And yet 400 years later, and they're still just kind of hanging out saying, we're going to stay in this city and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a pretty bold thing. They're feeling like they're kind of sitting there and they're in a very protected position. We see that there was failure on the part of some of those previously. We read about it in Judges or even in Joshua, that as they're kind of coming through into the land and possessing, that they didn't actually get rid of all of the people of the land. And it created problems and difficulties. I don't intend to over-spiritualize the Scripture. The Scripture has a lot to be able to say in and of itself. But, those times at which when the Lord calls us to victory and we leave remnants of failure in our own lives or compromise, it always comes back to bite us. It always comes back and ends up being harder than if we had just done what God was calling us to do in the first place. Here we have these that are Jebusites, and they're dwelling in this city that is going to become Jerusalem. It's going to be named Jerusalem. But at the time it was Jebus, dominated by these Jebusites, and it had been for a long time. David may have selected it because it didn't really have any sort of real direct, initially in the plotting out of where territorial lands for the tribes would have been. Jerusalem would have been kind of right there on the border between Benjamin and Judah. But neither of them had really claimed it. Neither of them had really overwhelmed them and dispossessed the people. So it had been this kind of place that didn't really belong to one territory or tribe or the other, and it would end up being a good and proper seat of judgment, especially in its protected position. Kind of the way that we look at Washington, D.C. It doesn't really belong to Maryland, although it's like right there. It doesn't really belong to, Virginia. It doesn't certainly belong to Maine. Although, anyway. You look at like some of the ways in which we end up looking at this same, like the seat of government ends up being kind of its own separate entity. And I think it's good for it to kind of remain that way, that there doesn't, the establishment really isn't into its own state. It kind of exists separate or different than some of the rest. Jerusalem would seem to be that way in its selection and its situation. That it would have been easy for it to be a central place for people to feel like they could access without it being directly tied to one tribe's ownership, so to speak, but that it would have been a place for everybody to feel like they could go to. I think that's really helpful. Not that I want to get too political either, but I think that's really helpful for DC to maintain that as well. That it ends up being like not a state of its own, but a place where every state feels like it has representation and can kind of come to. I think there's some reasonableness to that. But you look at what's going on here, and here's David saying, we want to take this city, and whoever smites it, he says in verse 6, they'll be like the general, first and captain. Joab had been in that room for the last 7+ years, more so while David was king. And it may have been that there were some things that David saw about Joab that he was like, this guy is not entirely right. He's a little, and he was. He was a guy that had killed Abner, who was the general for the what had been the northern tribes while they were separated. He ended up killing Abner in an unjustified killing. It wasn't in war or any of those types of things. And so it may have been that here's David saying, if there's somebody else that can take this, let's have that other guy take it. And Joab's like, I don't think so. I'm going after it. And he ends up leading the charge to be able to take out what becomes Jerusalem. He's listed here, and we're going to have this kind of list of men that were very strong. But he seems to be the first kind of that's mentioned of these mighty men. But even with all of that being the case, I think it's helpful for us to be able to realize in verse 9, David waxed greater and greater, and the reason is given there. More than any other, I think, the reason why David was greater and greater is given in the last part of that verse 9. It was the Lord of hosts was with him. The Lord of hosts being a, kind of a military term of itself, that here is God of the armies was with David. David was going to be great, and the Lord had plans for David. But David was going to be great because the Lord is great. Ultimately, my dear brother or sister, any of the way in which you or I would be able to be great is because the Lord is great and the Lord is working in our lives. If you really want there to be an opportunity for greatness to happen in your life, then allow the Lord to work greatly in your life. You're not going to expect to see that there's going to be some sort of great and lasting legacy except for as you point to Him. Point to God. Let all of your life be really a magnification of who He is, Allow him to be the one that is dominant and primary. You see that being the case here in David, and I think a study of David's life, we would end up seeing that at what points he ended up focusing on himself are the chapters that we would just as soon turn the page kind of quick on. The times at which he was trusting in the Lord and magnifying the Lord are the ones that we find great encouragement. The chapters that we end up wanting to kind of linger and dwell upon. You remember when he was there fighting against Goliath? Why was he doing it? Was it because he was like, hey, I really got to be king someday, so I got to get my resume out there and start building my resume? That wasn't it at all. He was out there slaying the giant because of the offense that he was making against God. It was a credit to the Lord. Everything that he wanted to do was as a matter of credit to the Lord. He didn't want anything for himself. He was content to just be a shepherd boy. And the Lord had greater plans for him, and you see that as he was trusting. The same is going to be the case in your life or in mine. If we would just simply trust the Lord, we would end up seeing him do greater things in our lives, I believe. He was great, and he was getting greater and greater because the Lord was with him. And some of this greatness, and I appreciate how it kind of talks about that way, because then we're going to see that there are other people in his life that came alongside and were of one mind to facilitate the plan of the vision that David had. So often in the way in which we might be used by God, or whatever kind of greatness might exist, you're going to end up seeing that there are people who are going to rally around or are going to be unified in that same kind of thrust or impetus to be able to say, yes, let's go and trust the Lord. Let's serve the Lord together. You see, David was a man able to lead some of these guys who, as we're going to read, very strong, very brave, very courageous men. And David was able to appropriately lead them. The Lord was really working to unify their hearts. May that always be the case in our country, in our land, and certainly within the church. It says, verse 10, these also are the chief of the mighty men whom David had, who strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom and with all Israel to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. And this is the number of the mighty men whom David had. Jashobeam, an Hachmonite, the chief of the captains, he lifted up his spear against 300 slain by him at one time. Not exactly a guy you want to mess with. If here's a guy who, here in Chronicles, it says that he killed 300, Samuel, it records him killing 800 at one time. That's not really the guy that you end up trying to pick a fight with too well. Here's a guy who, as he's fighting, his hand can, because he's clutching it so tight, and it became as though it was one in his hand, they had a hard time prying it out of his hand. That's this guy. And he ends up taking down of his enemies 300 or 800 at a time. It's really helpful to have a guy on your side like that, don't you think? A guy who's saying, you know what, we're gonna go after it, and it doesn't matter however many enemies, let them all come. And here he is fighting them all back. Here's this other guy, the next one here, verse 12, it says, and after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, odd name for his dad, the Ahohite, who was one of the three mighties. He was with David at Pasdamim, and there the Philistines were gathered together to battle, where was a parcel of ground full of barley. And the people fled from before the Philistines. And they set themselves in the midst of that parcel and delivered it and slew the Philistines, and the Lord saved them by a great deliverance. This guy, amazing. He ends up seeing this field of barley, which, it's not exactly the most valuable of commodities, barley. But here's this guy saying, no, this is the land that the Lord has given to us, and I'm not going to relinquish one bit of it. I'm going to fight back even against the enemies. We're not running. We're going to stand and defend even this ground here. I had a brother in the Lord, I count him a dear friend. He was my backyard neighbor when I lived in Bangor, Larry Cook. And I remember him, he and I would be talking, and he was saying, if anybody came up and wanted to assault him and take all of his money, he said, even if I had a nickel, I'd fight to the death for that nickel. I earned it. He didn't, Those types of guys I really appreciate, where he's like, nope, I don't care. Right is right, and it doesn't matter however much. By little or by much, if somebody's willing to take me for a nickel, they're willing to take me for a lot more than that. I'm going to fight for every last bit that the Lord has entrusted to me. Here you see that with this guy. It seems like he's saying, I'm not going to worry about the value of the land. It's the principle of the situation. God has given this to me. He's entrusted this to me, and I'm going to fight to the death for it. It doesn't seem to matter as a scale of what people consider to be worthwhile or reasonable or worth the effort or not, but that the Lord ends up doing things in people's lives to say, you know what, there's value that goes beyond what ends up just being the economy of the situation. I really thank the Lord that he cares about a place like Washington County, Maine, where the rest of the world, you guys may not realize, but this isn't exactly the center of newsmaking area. Except for maybe a week and a half ago. But this isn't exactly like the hub of activity and everybody wants to know ooh, what's going on in Calais, Maine? You do realize that that for all of the ways in which there's a lot of other places to get a lot of attention, even within our own state. Think about the attention that ends up being given to places like Portland or Augusta. Nobody really knows where Calais is. You know what I mean? You think about other places in the world that get all kinds of attention. Washington, D.C., what happens there? Or, L.A., apparently there are guys that can kick a ball around that are getting all kinds of attention right now. Look at them go. They don't use their hands. Congratulations. You see some of those types of things that end up happening where all the world ends up being given their attention to certain things. Or, we certainly see there's all kinds of attention being given to Tehran in the news cycle. Or there's all kinds of attention that's given to Jerusalem. There are places in the world that don't receive anywhere near the attention. Calais, Maine is on that list of places that by the world's standards would seem to be less important. Not really a large mover and shaker of the economic well-being of even the state that we live in. And yet, does God care about the people that are here? Does God care about what's going on here? I'm grateful that there are people who would say, you know what, I don't care what the rest of the world thinks. I'm going to stand and hold my ground right here where the Lord has placed me. I'm not going to give up 1 inch of this. This is where the Lord has placed me, and I intend to fight to the death for it. It's so much greater when we end up having people who have the vision that the Lord would have to be able to say, I want to be invested and involved in what he's got going on. Here we have this guy, and he was willing to do that. And the Lord saved them, it says at the end of verse 14. The Lord saved them by a great deliverance. Verse 15, it says, now 3 of the 30 captains went down to the rock to David into the cave of Adullam, and the host of the Philistines encamped in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in the hold, and the Philistines' garrison was then at Bethlehem. So this gives another occasion. There was this event, whether before he was king or once he was king. It's not really entirely sure by the chronology of what is being written here in this chapter. Nevertheless, there is David in the cave of Adullam, a place he had spent a fair amount of time when he was on the run from Saul. But now it isn't Saul that's the enemy. The primary enemy is the Philistines. And they're encamped there in the valley, and David is in a very precarious position, and he's kind of cut off from some of these other places. And it says, Verse 16 again, David was in the hold. The Philistines' garrison was then at Bethlehem, and David longed and said, "Oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem that is at the gate." You know, David, knowing that the enemies were entirely encamped and had overwhelmed and kind of overtaken, were dwelling in this area of Bethlehem, that, you know, place where David would have been, no doubt, had tasted the waters, maybe even as a boy, you know, a place that he had spent some time. And he just thinking about how could the enemy be in that spot. And oh, if only I could just taste the water of that place again. Well, he's got some guys that are really crazy, that are on his side. And David, he ends up saying this. He allows it to kind of come out of his mouth. And these guys hear it and they're like, let's do it. He's saying, oh, if only I could have a drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem that is at the gate. Well, verse 18 says, and the three break through the host of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. But David would not drink of it, but poured it out to the Lord, and said, my God forbid it me, that I should do this thing. Shall I drink the blood of these men that have put their lives in jeopardy? For with the jeopardy of their lives they brought it. Therefore he would not drink it. These things did these three mightiest. Really a fascinating account here. You have these three guys that say, hey, he wants some water. Let's go get it for him. And they don't care about what the long odds look like. If you think about this, if you got three guys that are going to fetch water and they're trying to break through a whole encampment, you know, they're looking to break through the lines of an army that is there for battle. You got three guys who are looking to go through there, and it doesn't look like they were doing it, you know, stealthily exactly. They broke through the line. Think about what it would take to draw water. Can a guy still be in combat and draw water, do you think, from a well? Or are they going to end up being kind of occupied with one other? Like, it's a good thing that maybe there were three, because you got two who are going to be having to fight back the enemy, while one is like drawing water. And can you imagine the two being like, can you go any faster? Sorry, the well's a little deeper than I remembered. Can you imagine? And how do you get the water back? You know, can you screw the cover on the canteen? Quick, come on, quick. Could you imagine being in that situation? They, you know, I wouldn't want them to be thinking that they could just carry it in like a cup. You know, you start running with a cup of water. No, we got to go back. I spilled so much of this, there's nothing left. Go back, go back. Could you imagine how difficult this task actually would have been to accomplish? And here are these three guys saying, you know what, let's do it. If that's what he wants, if that's what he needs, then let's make it happen for him. That's kind of an amazing level of unity and care for somebody that was there in such a position as David, don't you think? They were like, let's do it, let's go for it. Well, they get back and they, you know, David might have been like, where'd you guys go? Said, hey, we got that water you were looking for. Could you imagine? And David all of a sudden realizing these guys are actually going to do what out of maybe something that comes out of my mouth flying out. These guys are actually going to go and try and accomplish it. They did it where they could like lose their life. You look at the way in which he looks at this and he says, you know, he's like, how could I drink this? This is like the blood of these men. You remember how our Lord Jesus, it's recorded in John chapter 2, that he turned water into wine? Here is David looking at the water being turned to the blood of these men, saying, you know, they sacrificed their lives for the sake of this water. I can't drink this. This isn't an appropriate thing for me to just kind of say, yeah, your life is really meaningless as long as I get water to, you know. I just wanted that one bit of water that I wanted, that it was really hard to get. I expected that you should have done it for me. Thank you. About time. What took you so long? Could you imagine if David had had that attitude? Do you think anybody really would have wanted to adventure their life for the guy the next time? That he would just be like, that was good. Can I have another? Wouldn't that have been disrespectful to the sacrifice that those guys just made? But here he is recognizing the gift that they were giving to him, and he's turning all of that then back as a sacrifice and a gift, honoring what they did and really giving it to the Lord. Saying, this is not right for me to be able to have this. This doesn't really belong to me. This kind of an offering or this kind of a sacrifice, it shouldn't go to a single man. This kind of worthy sacrifice where somebody would be willing to give up their life, it belongs to the Lord. Everything that we do should be directing people to the Lord. Our service should be for the Lord. It's not for the sake of men. It's not for the sake of David here that David ends up recognizing, no, this really belongs to the Lord. And so he pours this out as like a drink offering to the Lord. It says, verse 20, going to this next, it says, and Abishai, the brother of Joab, he was chief of the three. For lifting up his spear against 300, he slew them and had a name among the three. So, you get an idea about this guy who is brother to Joab. Joab, we had seen his name listed with his brothers. Here, Abishai and Asahel is going to be mentioned in verse 26, brother of Joab. But we see that he did something very similar to what the guy before had done. We see another guy mentioned in verse 22, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts. He slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. Could you imagine what that would have looked like? What does a lion-like man look like, do you figure? I think his hair might have been longer than mine. Can you imagine the fierceness to actually call somebody a lion-like man? Could you imagine the fierceness? I don't think it's talking about a lion-like man in the way in which he was just docile and able to be well controlled. I don't think that this is referring to lion-like men like like caged and emasculated, docile kind of creatures. It's referring to lion-like men, and he went and killed 2 of these types of guys. Just for good measure, in case you weren't sure he could actually take out a lion, look at what it says at the end of this verse. It says also he went down and slew a lion in a pit in a snowy day. He killed 2 lion-like men. Oh yeah, and he also killed a lion. I mean, this guy is... think about the guys that he's got here, David, that he's attracting to himself. And we read this list, and it's almost easy to forget that it was actually all the down and outs, the downcast, the downtrodden, the people in debt, the lowlifes, the losers, people like us that were attracted to a man like David, and he actually gave them some sort of purpose or opportunity or meaning for what their life could actually look like. And you see the way in which they responded, so inspired. This guy, Benaiah, verse 23, it says, he slew an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits high, and in the Egyptian's hand was a spear like a weaver's beam, and he went down to him with a staff and plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and slew him with his own spear. He goes up to a giant, the guy's like, 8 feet tall or something, 7 or 8 feet tall, and he goes up and takes the spear out of this dude's hand and kills him with his own spear. This Benaiah dude, he is not messing around. This guy doesn't play. Verse 24 says, these things did Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and had a name among the 3 mighties. Behold, he was honorable among the 30, but attained not to the first 3, and David set him over his guard. He was like, yeah, let's have you be my head of personal security. Like, you seem like you're good at this kind of security detail work. Let's do that. Benaiah, he ends up being very helpful later on in the transition between David to Solomon. We have a list of men, begins there with Asahel in verse 26, valiant men of the armies. I'm not going to read all of these names because I don't need to butcher them for you, just like as we were going through those first 10 chapters. The only other one that I would really want to draw your attention to, listed in this group of names as we go through, would be Uriah the Hittite. You'll find his name embedded in there. He was the one that was married to Bathsheba that David is going to, in the future, have sin. You know, it's going to end up being a cause of sin in his life. But we have some of those names that are listed. Uriah is mentioned there in verse 41 if you're looking for him. So we have, most of these guys, we don't really know them exactly by all of their exploits, but you get the idea that there's a lot of guys that are very important. Coming into chapter 12, it says, "Now these are they that came to David to Ziklag, while he yet kept himself close because of Saul, the son of Kish. And they were among the mighty men, helpers of the war. They were armed with bows and could use both the right hand and the left in hurling stones and shooting arrows out of a bow, even of Saul's brethren of Benjamin." So here are guys that are equipped, and it really didn't matter which side you attacked them on, they were going to be able to take you out. They're able to do just as much lethal work with the left or the right hand. And that would be such a benefit to them in any kind of combat. And it mentions some of their names there in verses 3 and 4 and 5, down to verse 7. Verse 8, it says, "And of the Gadites there separated themselves unto David into the hold to the wilderness men of might, and men of war, fit for the battle, that could handle shield and buckler, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and were as swift as the roes upon the mountains." That is a strong combination. You have somebody who is like strong as a lion and, fast as a gazelle, That is a unique and very beneficial blend, especially if you're in combat, don't you think? And so as you're looking at some of these things, they're a little bit different. It doesn't say that they could do some of the same stuff, hurling stones and shooting arrows with both the right and the left hand like they was talked about in verse 2, but they had their own kind of beneficial tactics, ways in which they were strong to be able to do things. We read about some of these guys, and again, some of their names listed there, beginning in verses 9 through 13. It says in verse 14, "These were of the sons of Gad, captains of the host. One of the least was over 100, and the greatest over 1,000. These are they that went over Jordan in the first month, when it had overflown all his banks, and they put to flight all them of the valleys, both toward the east and toward the west." Interesting here as it's talking about that. At the time, they're going and doing this at a time when the Jordan River would have been overflowing its banks. There's a lot of strength in the midst of a river that is overflowing its banks like that. You would think that if you were having to cross over the river, you wouldn't want to have to just barely cross over the river and think about the strength that it would take to be able to get there with all whatever your kind of gear of warfare might be, but then you have an enemy on the other side. These guys, it didn't matter. They were willing to go after it. Crossing the river, even when it's in its strength, and still going after the enemy and putting to flight all of them of the valleys, as it says, both toward the east and toward the west. If this is, by the way, as we're kind of reading through this, if this is what the world looks at as a matter of toxic masculinity, we really would do well to have more of it. You know what I mean? Men that would actually be willing to say, I see that there's a need, and I see that there's something that needs to be done, and I'm willing to go through, even whether it be as a matter of my own physical exhaustion, and yet I'm still going to perform the task, or whether it ends up being at risk of my own life. For the sake of what is actually the call, I'm willing to go. God, here I am, use me to whatever extent you would want to, and I'll expend all of my energies for your glory. If only we had more. You see the world around us looking to sap masculinity out of men so often. It doesn't seem to be in any way here, as we're reading this, a detriment to the situation that was going on. In fact, this seems to be a virtuous kind of thing, that these guys are willing to stand up the way that they were. It's really helpful that men ended up acting like men. Here, as it continues, we end up coming to some of the other kind of exploits about these guys. It says, and David went out to meet them. Sorry, verse 16, this of Benjamin and Judah. It says, there came the children of Benjamin and Judah to the hold unto David. And David went out to meet them and answered and said unto them, if you be come peaceably unto me to help me, mine heart shall be knit unto you. But if you be come to betray me to mine enemies, seeing there is no wrong in my hands, the God of our fathers look thereon and rebuke it. And the Spirit came upon Amasai, who was chief of the captains, and said, thine are we, David, and on thy side, thou son of Jesse. Peace, peace be unto thee, and peace be to thine helpers, for thy God helpeth thee. Then David received them and made them captains of the band. So we have even these that are coming of Judah and of Benjamin, these that would have been kind of previously confederate or affiliated with Saul, and they're coming and saying, no, we're with you. David having this kind of check about them and saying, are you really with me? And they say, yeah, we're really with you. He says, oh, I'm so glad to have you. You know, he welcomes them into the midst. We have this next group, verse 19, and there fell some of Manasseh to David when he came to the Philistines against Saul to battle, but they helped them not. For the lords of the Philistines upon advisement sent him away, saying, he will fall to his master Saul to the jeopardy of our heads. This event that is being referenced is the, when David would have otherwise gone to fight. Instead, he ends up being turned back. The Philistines were like, we don't want this. He's Jewish. We don't want him going to fight against our enemies, the Jews. He's Israeli. He's going to turn back to them. This is going to be bad. And so he's excused from battle. Well, he goes back, you may remember, in his town where his wife and children, all of the families had been spoiled by this traveling band. They come back to Ziklag. It says, verse 20 here in 1 Chronicles 12, as he went to Ziklag, there fell to him of Manasseh Adnah and Jozabad and Jediel and Michael and Jozabad and Elihu and Zilthai, captains of the thousands that were of Manasseh. And they helped David against the band of the rovers, for they were all mighty men of valor and were captains in the host. For at that time, day by day, there came to David to help him until it was a great host like the host of God. So, these of Manasseh came and helped him recover what the rovers had burned Ziklag, and David went and beat him back, rescued all of his wife, his wife and children and all the rest of the families, Verse 23 says, and these are the numbers of the bands that were ready armed to the war and came to David to Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul to him according to the word of the Lord. The children of Judah that bear shield and spear were 6,800 ready armed to the war. Of the children of Simeon, mighty men of valor for the war, 7,100. Of the children of Levi, these guys would have been the priests, and yet they're still looking to war. Look, it says, of the children of Levi, 4,600. And Jehoiada was the leader of the Aaronites, and with him were 3,700. And Zadok, a young man mighty of valor, and of his father's house 22 captains. Verse 29 says, and of the children of Benjamin, the kindred of Saul, 3,000, for hitherto the greatest part of them had kept the ward of the house of Saul. And of the children of Ephraim, 20,800 mighty men of valor, famous throughout the house of their fathers. And of the half tribe of Manasseh, 18,000, which were expressed by name, to come and make David king. And of the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. The heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment. Of Zebulun, such as went forth to battle, expert in war with all instruments of war, 50,000 which could keep rank. They were not of double heart. And of Naphtali, 1,000 captains, and with them with shield and spear, 30 and 7,000. And of the Danites, expert in war, 20 and 8,600. And of Asher, such as went forth to battle, expert in war, 40,000. And on the other side of Jordan, of the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, with all manner of instruments of war for the battle, on 120,000. All these men of war that could keep rank came with a perfect heart to Hebron to make David king over all Israel. And all the rest also of Israel were of one heart to make David king. I've been really stuck in all of both of these chapters. I've been really stuck on this comment that was made in verse 33 and then repeated in verse 38. These men, it says, that could keep rank, and they were not of a double heart, it says in verse 33. It says in verse 38 that they could keep rank and came with a perfect heart. Both of those things are really helpful. Bravery in the midst of whatever ends up being the challenge, they kept rank. That is, when an assault comes, it isn't that they were just able to do their drill and ceremony in such a way that they could do it all for show, that they really were snappy and well in step on parade day. But they kept rank in the midst of warfare. They didn't break ranks. They didn't run. When trials and difficulties came, they maintained a unified front so that they kept rank and continued to move forward. And they were not of a double heart. It says that they came with a perfect heart. They weren't having a little side agenda or a side hustle, or they had their own kind of thing going on. They didn't have a division in what their purposes were, but they came with sincerity. They would keep rank, and they didn't have any duplicity. They didn't have a hidden motive. They didn't have a hidden agenda. They didn't have their own kind of side idea of what they wanted to be able to do. I go through and read all of these kinds of things, and this is really to the point that I want to be able to make this morning. As much as we would read any of these things and say, hey, this is really great for David, but what does this mean for me? You read all of that and you realize that there is a great purpose that David had in establishing a kingdom and even a dynastic reign that was going to last for many generations. And you think about like the forging of the nation of Israel and all of the ways in which they would have been expected to kind of go through, and the leaning that they had for so many generations upon the lordship of God himself, acting in some ways as a theocracy. You see that they were governed at various times by different judges. You had Moses who led them out of Egypt, Joshua that led them into the land, judges that took over afterwards. And they came to the place where they wanted a king. Not willing to rely on God anymore to be the one that directed them. They wanted a human king. And the first one that they chose, Saul, was not great. God said, let me do the choosing. And he chose David. And for all of the establishment and for all of the way in which the nation of Israel was intended by God to be able to reach and work and move in the world, you see, and you can imagine from the perspective of the writer of Chronicles, they're writing from when Israel and Judah were vanquished. All of the buildup and all of the work and all of the struggle and all of these great men that existed in their history, and almost as though there's a hearkening, where are those men today? When you're coming out of the Babylonian captivity, don't you think? Overcome and overwhelmed as they were. And there are purposes that they were going to need to try and draw off of some of the things of their own history to be able to say, hey, let's remember where we came from. Let's remember the stock that we came from. I have no real problem with patriotism, and I think that patriotism is really great. What is better than patriotism as it relates for our own nation here is to recognize that we are citizens of heaven. And for all of our patriotism, and I think that it is right and proper for us to be able to hearken back to great men that have been used to build up these great United States. I'm grateful for men, as you read the accounts of people like George Washington. and how it seems very evident to me that God used a man like George Washington in the help and establishment of our great country here. This country that we live in, except for those of you from the north, and with apologies, I don't really know Canadian history maybe as well as I ought to. You'll forgive the love that I have for my own nation. But our great nation here, these United States, has been, since its founding, one of the greatest exporters of missionaries to the world. And I make no apologies about that. I am so grateful that the Lord would be able to use men like George Washington to help establish this land to those ends and for those means, that I would just as soon we be able to come back to a place where there is freedom for the gospel to go forth, not just among our own citizens, but to the world at large. And may that be the case. It takes effort on behalf of men, and God uses men. I'm grateful for the people that you end up reading about. And, I don't necessarily agree with all of their tactics or for all of their politics or for all of the other kinds of stuff, but I can appreciate the forward movement of men like Paul Revere or Nathaniel Hale or, men like Samuel Adams, not for what he's become known as more recently. I'm grateful for men like Abraham Lincoln, the ways in which he would fight to try and preserve the Union, or Ulysses S. Grant. I'm grateful for some of these guys that we can look back to in our history and say, these are men that ended up fighting for something. They had a cause that they were really concerned about maintaining. We can look back and say that there were these men that, we call them the greatest generation, willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to allow for the destructive policies of this kind of nation to take over and exploit and beat down and commit genocide against the Jews. No, we're going to push back against Germany. I'm grateful for people who would stand up and say, no, not on my watch. And you see the way that is more and more the kind of softening up and the soft selling of what we're supposed to be able to do as people. And you see, while we're still called the United States of America, it seems more and more we are so divided, doesn't it? It used to be, I remember this being the case, it used to be in school, they would remind us of these slogans like, united we stand, divided we fall. Do you think that there's a lot of teachers in the public school that are reminding their students of that? It seems as though all of our systems are fomenting this idea of division, and there aren't people who keep ranks. And for as bad as we look at that happening in our country here, and as bad as we see that happening in the world around us, you know what I think is even more sinister? Is when it happens within the church. And it ought to be that for all of the situations that are going on and for all of the ways in which these guys would do these things for David, what should we be doing for the Son of David, for our Messiah, for our Lord Jesus? That we would actually be able to maintain ranks and have a pure heart. We would say, I don't really care about whatever the denominational kinds of things are, as much as are we going in the same kind of direction to advance the cause of Christ. I am by no means thinking that we should be ecumenical. I don't think that we should just kind of make compromises on foundational doctrine, but I think that there are things that end up happening as a matter of secondary that we don't really have to worry about. Styles or substance or forms or formalities or all that stuff. We can have differences, and we do. We're distinct as a church from some of the other churches that are around. We do things a little different than they do. That's fine. They can do things wrong. We can do things right. That's fine. Point being, we should not be breaking rank. In whatever way that we are looking to advance the cause of Christ, we ought to be able to do that with our brothers and sisters, even if they end up being kind of a different tribe, you know? Even if they have a little bit of a different kind of view of how things are going. Maybe they end up being more like Issachar, that had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. Those guys are really helpful. Just as much as we need the guys that are armed with, the sword or the spear. If we would, as members of the body of Christ together, be looking to move forward in unity, recognizing where we have these similarities and maintaining the strength of these core doctrines. And by that I mean that Jesus Christ is the only means of salvation, that the Scripture, the Bible, is the authoritative Word of God. We can kind of agree on some of these kinds of core doctrinal things. I don't need to get to where I'm like trying to do some sort of competitive, and we shouldn't look at it as a matter of competitive kinds of ways in which we're trying to one up another church or whatever else. We're on the same side. Let's fight together. Let's keep rank. I'm grateful for the place that we live here, because it's really easy for us to identify a whole lot easier who's kind of with us and who isn't. And that we're able to recognize in kind of a different way, like to say, I'm not sure that church is entirely quite right with what they got going on. If you're wondering which one I'm specifically thinking of and referring to in my own mind, it's the Episcopal Church in town. I cannot, in good conscience, say that we are going in the same direction as Sarah Gavitt is. I'm not going in the same direction as she is. And it's like heartbreaking to me. I don't see how somebody could be able to say we're a church and they have nothing to do with the cause of Christ or recognizing what His Word says. But I have absolutely zero problem with being able to say, hey, let's be in lockstep with Caleb Ricker or with Matthew Burden. I've got no problem saying, there are some differences that maybe some of these other guys have around us, but there's a way in which we can go forward with those guys. There's a way in which we can kind of keep rank with those guys. There's a way in which I can keep rank with Bobby Oliver, Scott Cheesebro, Thane Youngsma. I can keep rank with some of these guys. Say, let's go after it together. You see the way in which division ends up happening within the church, and it never really ends up being helpful. I think it ought to be the case even within our church. We can look at it as kind of a broader kind of scale of what ends up happening, the church at large, but I think it ought to be the case even within our own church also. We end up saying, I'm not going to break ranks. I'm not going to kind of allow when the enemy creates challenges or difficulties. I'm not looking to break ranks. Let's figure out how we move forward. It's so easy to break ranks. Let's not do it. Let's go forward the way that we ought to be able to honor the Lord, Well, all these guys, they came together to be able to make David king. And it says, verse 39, there they were with David 3 days, eating and drinking, for their brethren had prepared for them. Moreover, they that were nigh them, even unto Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali, brought bread on asses and on camels and on mules and on oxen, and meat, meal, cakes of figs and bunches of raisins, and wine and oil and oxen and sheep abundantly, for there was joy in Israel. That sounds like a great potluck. What an amazing thing to be able to come together and say, there's such joy because things are set in their right order. That there ends up being such unity. And you could see where after what had been 7 years of kind of this tenuous relationship that, Chronicles doesn't really mention. They kind of skirt over some of that to be able to get to where, there was joy. Remember when there was joy? And shouldn't that be the case with our churches? Shouldn't it be, again, whether it be just in our congregation here or the kind of way that we look at the broader way in which the Lord would be working in our area, that we would be able to serve with joy. So much better to be able to have that. Trials and difficulties come. Let's enjoy when there ends up being a season of peace where we can celebrate together. Trials and difficulties, war, it's going to happen. And when it does, let's make sure that our heart is set to not break ranks and to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to go forward with a pure heart, not double-hearted, not double-minded. I don't want to be unstable. Lord, help me to be able to go forward the way that I ought to. Amen? If you guys would stand, let's sing a song on the way out.